Hello and welcome to Sleepy Stories. I hope you're doing well today. Wherever you're listening from and whatever time it is for you right now, I'm truly glad you're here. It's always a quiet wonder to think about how a story like this can travel, slipping across rooms and cities, crossing countries and continents, until it gently arrives in so many different nights. Before we begin, I'd like you to imagine something. Imagine that you are sitting alone in a quiet room late in the evening. The candles have burned low. The city outside is already asleep. In front of you lies a single letter, no seal of a king, no declaration of war, just careful handwriting and a promise. You are not a general. You are not a monarch. And yet, what you decide tonight may determine whether an army marches, whether a fleet is built, or whether a war continues for another year. Now imagine this question settling in your mind. How much power does someone truly hold when they can decide when a state can afford to fight? Tonight's history follows that question into the shadows and into a world where money moved quietly, promises carried weight, and the future tax receipts of entire kingdoms were turned into spending that could happen now. Between the 16th and the 18th centuries, European wars grew longer, more international, and vastly more expensive. Armies expanded. Navies became permanent institutions rather than seasonal expeditions, and fortifications turned into engineered landscapes that consumed iron, timber, stone, gunpowder, and wages. States needed cash in particular places at particular times. Pay for troops in the Low Countries, grain for garrisons on a frontier, timber and rigging in a shipyard, subsidies to an ally, bribes to a border official, carts and horses for a march. The hard part was not merely raising money in the long run, but converting uneven flows of tax into reliable payments in the short run, often far from the capital, and often during crises that disrupted trade. That is where the banker's shadow enters the story. In popular speculation, hidden families and secret networks are imagined as deciding wars behind closed doors, as if they could steer governments like puppets. The documented reality is more precise and, in its own way, more interesting. Financial networks did not usually decide wars in the sense of choosing winners by willpower. They decided what was possible at a given moment. They decided which promises could be turned into cash, which states could survive a liquidity crisis, how quickly a government could recover from a defeat, and whether an army might go unpaid at the worst time. Their influence worked through instruments and institutions. Loan contracts, annuities, tax assignments, bills of exchange, joint stock subscriptions, sinking funds, monopolies, and the daily routines of accounting. And because much of this depended on correspondence, intermediaries, and negotiated confidence, it produced the permanent temptation to imagine a hidden hand, even where the mechanisms are visible on the page. To understand why so many people still speculate, it helps to begin with a basic constraint that shaped early modern Europe. The center of political authority and the center of money were often not the same place. A monarch might rule from Madrid, Paris, Vienna, or London, but liquid capital clustered where trade concentrated. In cities with dense merchant communities, reliable courts, and a steady flow of information, Augsburg in the 16th century, Genoa and Antwerp, Amsterdam in the 17th, London increasingly in the 18th. Governments needed those markets, but those markets were not governments. They were coalitions of families, partnerships, syndicates, and sometimes corporate bodies, town councils, chartered companies, guild-linked merchant houses. That separation created a continual negotiation. When a state went to war, it tried to convert authority into credit. When financiers extended credit, they tried to convert risk into enforceable claims. In the 16th century, the most dramatic example of this negotiation ran through the Habsburg world. The Habsburgs were not simply Spain. They were a dynastic complex. Castile and Aragon, overseas possessions, the Netherlands, Italian territories, and the imperial title in the Holy Roman Empire. Their wars were continental and multi-front, against France, against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant and Catholic rivals within the empire, and against rebellion in the Netherlands. They had silver from the Americas, but silver did not behave like a faucet that could be turned on. It arrived in fleets. It could be delayed by storms or intercepted. It had to be transported and guarded. And it arrived into a European economy where the problem was often timing. Soldiers needed to be paid on campaign schedules, not when bullion happened to arrive. Here, the famous banking houses of southern Germany, most notably from Augsburg, illustrate what a secret looks like in practice. These firms were merchants as much as bankers, with interests in mining, trade, and monopolies. They advanced money to rulers who needed immediate funds for elections, armies, and diplomacy. In return, they did not simply receive a vague promise. They received specific revenue streams, rights over mines, monopolies, customs revenues, or structured repayments tied to known taxes. The financing of imperial elections, for example, became a moment where money and sovereignty met in an unusually concentrated form. Electors expected payments, candidates raised funds, merchant bankers assembled consortia. Later storytellers could frame this as a hidden purchase of empire. The documented mechanism is less mystical but more revealing. Political legitimacy in the imperial system had a price, and the ability to mobilize large credit quickly could tilt a contested succession. But if Augsburg symbolizes one side of the relationship, the concentration of merchant capital, Genoa symbolizes another, the art of lending to a superpower that could, and sometimes did, refuse to pay on schedule. By the later 16th century, Genoese financiers were deeply entangled with the Spanish monarchy's short-term borrowing. The key point is that the crown's borrowing was not a single pile of debt. It was a structured portfolio of obligations. Some loans were long-term, with revenues pledged. Others were short-term contracts designed to bridge the gap between expenditures and expected receipts, including the arrival of bullion. A short-term loan might be repaid by assigning specific revenues or by rolling it into longer-term instruments under negotiation. When a state's revenues were complex and politically constrained, default was rarely a simple collapse. It could be a tactic, a forced renegotiation, or a symptom of administrative failure. In the Spanish case, multiple suspensions of payments under Philip II became part of the relationship between the Crown and its lenders. The Crown could halt payments on certain short-term instruments, compelling bankers to accept conversions or settlements that protected their position in the long run, often through new arrangements tied to more reliable revenue streams. The bankers, for their part, could survive such shocks if they were diversified, if they had privileged access to settlements, and if they could use their networks to manage liquidity while negotiations ran their course. This is the first major theme that later speculation tends to flatten: the difference between owing money and being able to pay right now. Early modern states often had revenues that, in theory, could cover costs over time. The crisis came when they needed large sums immediately or in distant theaters, and their fiscal machinery could not deliver. Bankers were specialists in time and distance. They could transform a promise of future revenue into present cash, and they could transform a payment in one place into a usable payment in another, using the technology of bills of exchange and correspondent networks. A bill of exchange was not just a piece of paper. It was a system of trust and enforcement. A merchant in Lyon could pay a banker to have funds available in Antwerp, the Antwerp correspondent could honor the bill. Accounts would be settled through trade flows and periodic clearing. For states, this was crucial. A government might need to pay troops in Flanders. Shipping coin was dangerous and slow. A network of bills could provide local currency or credit in the right city, with settlement occurring elsewhere. The shadow in this sense is the unseen settlement process. Multiple ledgers, offsetting claims, and the constant evaluation of counterparties. As wars expanded in scale, states increasingly faced an institutional challenge: how to turn borrowing from an emergency practice into a stable system. That question is at the heart of the Dutch and English stories, which then influenced the 18th century European balance of power. In the Dutch Republic, war and finance became bound together during the revolt against Habsburg rule and the long conflicts that followed. The Republic's political structure mattered. It was not a centralized monarchy. Authority was distributed among provinces and cities, with Holland as the richest and most influential province. This created constraints, but also a kind of credibility. When debt was issued by a province or a city with established tax revenues and administrative competence, investors could evaluate the specific entity, not just a royal personality. Debt instruments took forms such as annuities, including life annuities, and later more standardized securities. Investors could buy claims backed by taxes, and those claims could be traded or used as collateral. The market became, in effect, an extension of public finance. A critical element in the Dutch case was administrative capacity, the ability to assess taxes, collect them, and service debt on schedule. That meant record keeping, predictable institutions, and enforcement. It also meant political bargaining, because new taxes and borrowing had to be negotiated among provinces and interests. The result, over time, was a reputation for reliability that allowed the Dutch to borrow at relatively favorable rates for long periods, even under heavy military pressure. When people speculate about bankers deciding wars, this is a grounded place to look. It was not that Amsterdam's financiers chose Dutch strategy in a simple command and control sense. It was that the Republic's fiscal architecture, credible taxation, and service of debt allowed it to sustain war efforts that would have broken weaker systems. Amsterdam then became more than a Dutch story. It became a European clearinghouse. Capital from many places sought safe returns. Governments sought access to deep markets. Merchant banks and brokers specialized in placing loans and managing subscriptions. In this environment, a secret family rarely needed to be a literal conspiracy. A handful of houses could matter simply because they sat at the junction of information and placement. They knew which investors had liquidity, which governments were likely to pay, which war news was credible, and which rumors were designed to move prices. In England, the path to a funded debt system is often associated with the late 17th century and the wars against Louis XIV's France. England needed to raise large sums to sustain naval and military operations. Earlier English monarchs had borrowed, but often through ad hoc arrangements, forced loans, or expensive short-term credit. Political conflict in the 17th century, including civil war and regime changes, made credibility fragile. By the 1690s, the English state was seeking a more durable approach. The founding of the Bank of England in 1694 sits in this context. It was not merely a bank in the modern retail sense. It was a mechanism for lending to the government, managing certain aspects of government debt, and providing a stable institutional counterparty. Subscribers provided a large loan to the government, and in return received interest and corporate privileges. The bank's directors and shareholders were private, but the bank's existence depended on state charter and parliamentary acts. The relationship between the state and a chartered financial institution became a way to make borrowing systematic. What changed with a funded debt system was not that the government stopped relying on wealthy individuals. It changed the form of the claim. Instead of begging for personal loans from courtiers or trying to squeeze cash from short-term expedients, the state could issue standardized instruments, annuities, and later consolidated stocks that could be bought and sold. This did two things at once. It broadened the pool of lenders because one did not need to be personally close to the crown. One needed confidence in the instrument, and it made the claim liquid. Investors could exit by selling in the market rather than waiting for redemption. Liquidity, in turn, made investors more willing to buy in the first place because their money was not trapped. This liquidity is a second major theme worth repeating. Early modern secret influence often looks like the power to say yes or no in a crisis. But in a liquid market, influence shifts toward price. A government does not need a single banker to approve a loan if it can sell securities to many investors. Yet it becomes exposed to market sentiment. War news, political instability, and confidence in taxation all affect yields. That creates a different kind of vulnerability. Not dependence on one lender, but dependence on credibility itself. The early 18th century then produced financial episodes that still generate controversy and moral narratives because they involved secrecy, privileged information, and political entanglement. The South Sea Scheme and bubble in 1720 is a classic example. The South Sea Company had been created earlier, with a mix of trade ambitions and financial functions. Its debt conversion proposals aimed to take portions of government debt and swap them into company stock, altering the structure of obligations and, in theory, reducing financing costs. In practice, the scheme became entangled with speculative frenzy, political patronage, and the distribution of stock on terms that looked like bribery or influence. Parliamentary investigations followed the collapse, and the episode became a symbol of corruption and hidden dealing. Here, the mystery is not who did it. Many names are known, but how much was deliberate manipulation versus a system that encouraged self-deception? When share prices rise rapidly, it becomes possible to treat paper gains as real wealth, to use the rising price as evidence that the scheme is sound, and to justify further expansion. The mechanisms of early modern finance, options, insider allocations, credit on stock, were real and can be traced in records, but the psychological and political dynamics can still be debated. That mixture keeps speculation alive. Across the Channel, France provides another angle: the difficulty of sustaining war finance under a fiscal system constrained by privilege and fragmented administration. The French monarchy possessed large resources, but its taxation was uneven, contested, and in many cases collected through arrangements that siphoned revenue to intermediaries. It relied on a complex mix of offices, tax farms, and extraordinary expedients. In wartime, France could raise large sums, but servicing debt and maintaining confidence were persistent problems. Attempts at reform ran into political resistance. The French state's credit, therefore, behaved differently from Dutch or later British credit. It could be enormous but fragile under certain conditions, and frequently entangled with court politics and administrative opacity. That opacity is one reason a banker's shadow feels plausible. If investors cannot clearly see revenues and obligations, they substitute social knowledge. Who has access? Who is favored? Which banker is close to which minister? In such systems, information becomes a commodity. A banker's private correspondence and his ability to predict policy can matter as much as his balance sheet. By the mid-18th century, Britain's financial machinery had evolved toward more consolidated and standardized debt instruments, including consolidated annuities, that simplified administration and facilitated trading. Consolidation did not magically reduce costs, but it could improve marketability and reduce the administrative clutter of multiple separate issues. Britain's ability to borrow at scale became a strategic asset in long wars, particularly those that required sustained naval spending and subsidies to allies. This did not mean Britain always spent wisely or avoided crises. It meant that, compared with many rivals, it could continue paying and borrowing even after setbacks, because investors believed Parliament would tax and service the debt. At this point, the question, did financial networks decide wars, becomes sharper. Consider what actually decides a war in the 18th century. Armies are not just bodies with muskets. They are payroll systems. They are bread, fodder, uniforms, gunpowder, hospitals, transport contracts, and pay chests that must arrive on schedule or desertion and disorder follow. Navies are dockyards, victualling, timber supply, rope walks, tar, cannon foundries, and administrative offices that can audit and contract at scale. The side that can keep these systems running longer can often endure losses that would otherwise be fatal. Financial networks mattered because they operated inside those supply systems. Contractors needed credit to deliver bread today and be paid later. Shipbuilders needed advances. Governments issued bills to pay suppliers, and suppliers discounted those bills through bankers. In effect, war mobilization pulled private credit into public service. When the state's paper was trusted, the private economy could carry the war's logistical burden because it believed repayment would come. When the state's paper was distrusted, suppliers demanded cash, and the war effort seized up. Yet this is also where the limits appear. Bankers could not conjure wheat when harvests failed, or ships when dockyards lacked timber. They could not instantly repair administrative incompetence. Credit could extend the state's reach, but it could also amplify failure. A government that borrowed heavily without improving revenue could drift toward crisis. A government that financed war by destabilizing its own currency could trigger inflation and social conflict. A government that leaned too much on privileged insiders could provoke political backlash. The secret family image often attaches to prominent houses that managed cross-border payments and loan placements. In Amsterdam, London, and other centers, merchant banks could act as intermediaries between sovereign borrowers and dispersed investors. They would assess risk, structure terms, and place bonds. They would maintain correspondence with agents in multiple capitals, receiving political and military news that could influence markets. They also dealt in commodities, insurance, and exchange, which meant they saw multiple indicators of war's progress. Not just battle news, but freight rates, bullion flows, and the availability of bills. This did not make them omnipotent. It made them well-informed and positioned to profit from being well-informed. That distinction matters for understanding controversy. Profiting from war finance can look, from the outside, like causing war, but the documented relationship is usually inverse. Wars created demand for finance, and finance responded. The response, however, could shape policy by changing what seemed feasible. If a minister believed that a loan could be placed in Amsterdam at acceptable terms, he might be more willing to continue a campaign. If credit tightened, he might seek peace. In that way, the market's verdict could act like a constraint on strategy. Another recurring point of speculation is secrecy itself. Many dealings were private not because they were conspiratorial, but because privacy was an ordinary feature of commerce. Loan negotiations involved sensitive information, the borrower's desperation, the lender's conditions, and the political risks of disclosure. Correspondence moved through courier networks that were not secure by modern standards. States intercepted mail. Rivals tried to learn terms. A prudent banker did not publish his intentions. When later generations encounter gaps in documentation, lost letters, destroyed ledgers, deliberately vague public announcements, imagination rushes in. Yet even where documentation is abundant, interpretation remains difficult because early modern finance is full of intermediaries. A government might borrow from a syndicate. The syndicate might distribute claims to many investors. Those investors might include foreign nationals. The same banker might serve multiple clients. At the point of purchase, the investor might not care about policy. He might care about yield and liquidity. But the political implication, foreign money supporting a war, can later be framed as treasonous or sinister. In practice, it was often simply how capital markets worked. To see this in a more grounded way, it helps to follow a single wartime payment from intention to execution. Imagine a government deciding to send an army to a theater where it has few tax revenues, perhaps the Low Countries or northern Italy. The Treasury authorizes expenditures. Taxes at home will be collected over months. The army needs weekly pay. The government issues short-term bills or draws on existing credit lines. A banker in the capital arranges bills of exchange payable in a foreign city. A correspondent in that city provides funds, perhaps in local currency, perhaps through further bills. That correspondent will later be reimbursed, directly or indirectly, by the banker at home, who will be reimbursed by the state, which will be reimbursed by taxes. Every step involves trust and timing. If any step breaks, if tax revenues disappoint, if military defeat disrupts routes, if a political crisis undermines confidence, the chain shakes. The banker's role is to keep the chain from snapping, or to decide it is too risky and refuse, forcing the state to seek alternatives. This chain also shows why the story is not just about bankers, but about paperwork and administration. A state that can reliably account for revenues and expenditures can negotiate better credit because it can prove its capacity. A state that cannot produce clear accounts must compensate with higher interest, privileged concessions, or coercion. Over the long run, the winners in European great power competition tended to be those who built fiscal states capable of supporting long-term borrowing without destroying confidence. That is a structural answer, and it is less satisfying to conspiracy-minded curiosity precisely because it is impersonal. But it aligns with the evidence. Institutions, not single families, explain the durable advantages. Still, families did matter in an early modern sense because partnerships were personal and reputational. A banking house's name signaled a history of honoring obligations. Its correspondence relied on that name. Its credit could be ruined by a scandal, a bad gamble, or a political shock. In that environment, marriage alliances, apprenticeships, and patronage networks were business infrastructure. The boundary between family and firm was thin. A son or nephew might be trained to manage a branch abroad, not as nepotism alone, but as a way to place trust where formal corporate governance was limited. This is another place where modern audiences sense secrecy. The firm is literally a household network, spread across cities, coordinated by letters. As the 18th century progressed, the scale of government borrowing and the sophistication of markets increased. Britain's funded debt became a feature of European finance. The Dutch remained important lenders, and capital moved across borders. Merchant banks began to specialize in sovereign lending in ways that foreshadowed 19th century patterns. But inside the 18th century itself, the picture remains mixed. States could borrow heavily, But they also faced moments when credit tightened abruptly due to political shocks, ministerial changes, defeats, rumors of repudiation, or fears of currency debasement. In such moments, the banker's shadow lengthens in the public imagination because decisions really were made in private rooms. Whether to subscribe, whether to roll over bills, whether to accept a conversion, whether to continue discounting government paper. Those decisions could determine whether a fleet sailed on time or whether an army mutinied for lack of pay. The controversies that survive into modern curiosity often come from situations where the line between public service and private profit was blurred. Governments relied on contractors who profited from supply. They relied on financiers who charged fees, demanded privileges, or profited from exchange. In some cases, ministers themselves had financial interests. When such arrangements were exposed, opponents framed them as betrayal. Sometimes the allegations were exaggerated. Sometimes they were substantially true. But the deeper issue was structural. Early modern states did not have fully bureaucratized procurement systems insulated from private interest. They had hybrid systems where private enterprise delivered public capacity. That hybrid is not unique to one country. In many European states, revenue collection itself was often outsourced or mediated. Tax farming, where a private contractor paid the state an agreed sum for the right to collect certain taxes, profiting from the difference, could deliver immediate cash to the treasury and shift collection risk to private hands. But it could also encourage abuse, provoke resistance, and entangle state finance with private fortunes. When a state went to war, it might lean more heavily on such arrangements. The war then became not only a contest of armies, but a contest over the extraction and mobilization of resources. If you want the mystery that people still speculate about, it often concentrates in the gaps between the official narrative of state decision-making and the practical reality of financing. Officially, a war might be declared for dynastic rights, alliances, or security. Practically, it required a sequence of financial operations that created winners and losers before the first campaign season began. In hindsight, it is tempting to treat those winners as the cause, but the evidence usually supports a more constrained claim. Financial interests shaped the conditions under which wars were sustained, and sometimes shaped the timing and terms of peace, because they shaped liquidity and confidence. At the same time, there are genuine moments when financial constraints appear to have driven policy. A government might accept peace because it could not refinance short-term obligations. Another might gamble on a decisive campaign because it feared that another year of borrowing would trigger a crisis. A minister might restructure debt to lower interest, provoking anger among holders because servicing costs were crowding out operations. These are documented dynamics, but they are not the same as a secret committee choosing the battlefield. They are the pressure of arithmetic on strategy. To keep the story grounded in lived realities rather than abstraction, consider what happened to a soldier or sailor when finance faltered. Pay arrears were not merely an inconvenience. They could mean desertion, mutiny, or the collapse of discipline. An unpaid army could turn into a predator on the countryside it was supposed to protect, undermining political support. A navy that could not procure victuals could not sail, regardless of ships on the stocks. Commanders spent time negotiating with suppliers and local authorities, not only fighting. In this sense, credit was a weapon, but one that operated through the stomach, the ledger, and the calendar. As these systems matured, they also produced new forms of surveillance and secrecy. States cared about the confidence of investors and the stability of markets. They monitored exchange rates and bullion flows. They sometimes intervened against perceived manipulation. In some countries, Officials engaged in mail interception or intelligence gathering focused on finance and diplomacy intertwined. Because information could move markets, and markets could move policy, the boundary between state secret and commercial secret became porous. This is a point where speculation can be redirected into documented practice. Many 18th century governments did, in fact, seek to understand what bankers and merchants knew. They cultivated informants in trading cities. They tracked rumors that could damage credit. They negotiated with financial houses that had international correspondence, not because those houses ruled the state, but because they were nodes in the information network of Europe. When you step back, the long arc from the 16th to the 18th century looks less like a single shadowy cabal and more like an evolution in the technology of state survival. In the 16th century, rulers depended heavily on a narrower set of large merchant bankers and on specific revenue concessions, and they could lurch between borrowing and suspension of payments. In the 17th century, in places like the Dutch Republic, more institutionalized public debt markets tied to credible taxation emerged. In late 17th and 18th century Britain, parliamentary finance, chartered institutions, and increasingly standardized debt instruments allowed sustained borrowing at scale. In France and other monarchies, reforms struggled against structural constraints, and the tension between fiscal need and political privilege accumulated. None of this removes the human element. Individuals and families did become extremely wealthy from these systems. They did cultivate influence. They did sometimes place relatives in key positions, and they did sometimes benefit from privileged information. Scandals did occur, but the lasting historical importance lies in the systems, how paper promises became military capacity, how markets priced a government's credibility, and how war itself became a driver of institutional change. And this is where the banker's shadow becomes, at the end of the 18th century, less a secret and more a permanent feature of European power. Once a state can borrow reliably, it can sustain long wars, build navies, subsidize allies, and absorb defeats without immediate collapse. But it also binds itself to an internal constituency of creditors whose interests become politically significant. Servicing the debt requires taxation. Taxation requires legitimacy or coercion. Legitimacy requires institutions, representation, or at least predictable administration. The fiscal state is not merely a financial contrivance. It is a political transformation. The question that still invites curiosity, whether financial networks decided wars behind closed doors, can be answered most honestly by dividing decide into smaller verbs. Financial networks enabled, constrained, accelerated, delayed, and occasionally destabilized. They converted future revenue into present action. They made some strategies sustainable and others impossible. They rewarded some policies and punished others through the price of credit. They sometimes nudged states toward peace when refinancing failed. They sometimes made renewed war possible after defeat by restoring liquidity. And they did all this through institutions that were partly public and partly private, making the boundary between national purpose and private advantage permanently contested. By the 18th century, Britain's ability to borrow at scale was not just a matter of having rich people in London. It rested on a stack of interlocking routines. Parliament authorized taxes and spending, and that parliamentary authorization mattered because it signaled that repayment would be backed by a broad political settlement rather than the will of a single minister. The Treasury and its subordinate offices developed procedures for issuing instruments, recording ownership, and servicing interest. The Bank of England sat inside this ecology as a privileged intermediary, not as a sovereign authority, helping to manage payments and acting as a stabilizing institution in moments when confidence wavered. Around these public bodies sat a private market of brokers, jobbers, merchants, and bankers, who formed the practical interface between government paper and household savings, commercial profits, and foreign capital. The important point for understanding the shadow is that the market created a continuous referendum on the state's credibility. A government did not need to ask one great house for a single heroic loan if it could issue standardized debt that thousands of holders would buy. But it did need to maintain the conditions under which those holders would keep buying and would accept the going rate. That meant, above all, convincing the market that interest would be paid reliably, and that principle would not be repudiated. When investors feared a political break, civil disorder, revolutionary change, or a ministerial attempt to alter terms, the price of government paper could fall quickly, raising the effective cost of borrowing and transmitting political anxiety into financial constraint. This is why war finance and information became fused. A battle report could move prices, but so could a parliamentary vote, a rumor about a new tax, a hint that an ally might withdraw, or a whisper that a peace negotiation was nearer than expected. In a world where information traveled by courier and ship, and where official announcements were slow or crafted, those who had faster correspondence had an advantage. Merchant houses with branches in multiple ports and capitals could learn about a naval engagement, a blockade, or a ministerial crisis before the information reached the broader public. That advantage could be used for profit, for prudence, or for political leverage. It also generated suspicion. If a handful of people seemed to move before everyone else, it was easy to imagine that they were not reacting to events but producing them. The mechanics of war supply made that suspicion even more plausible. The 18th century fiscal military state relied on contractors. Armies required bread, meat, beer, oats, hay, shoes, coats, muskets, cartridge paper, tents, wagons, and horses. Navies required salted provisions, biscuit, beer, rum, rope, canvas, tar, timber, iron fittings, sailcloth, gunpowder, and medical stores. Procurement at this scale was rarely achieved by a central office buying everything itself. Instead, a state often used a mix of direct supply through government yards and contracting out to private firms. Contracts required advances. A contractor might need to buy grain months before delivery, pay laborers weekly, and hire transport. The state might pay slowly or pay in paper promises. The contractor then went to a banker to discount those promises into ready cash. Through this chain, the state's credit became the contractor's working capital, and the contractor's working capital became the soldier's ration. A financier's influence, therefore, often ran through the seemingly mundane question of whether paper could be turned into cash at acceptable loss. If government bills were readily discounted, contractors could operate and the army could march. If discounting became expensive or impossible, contractors might refuse to deliver without cash, or they might default, and the state would face the practical choice of paying more, seizing goods, or watching its operations falter. None of this required a secret meeting that decided the war. It required only a change in the market's willingness to treat government promises as near money. Subsidies to allies sharpened the same dynamic on a continental scale. In the 18th century, coalitions were common, and coalitions ran on transfers. A maritime power might subsidize an army power. A state with strong credit might finance another state's field forces to keep pressure on a common enemy. Those subsidies had to arrive on time, in usable form, and often across borders where currency types and political risks differed. Here again, financial networks were the infrastructure. Subsidy payments could be routed through bills of exchange and correspondent accounts rather than shipments of coin. The choice of route, the choice of intermediary, and the reputation of the house handling the transfer could determine whether an ally received funds smoothly or whether delays crippled operations. When people later talk about bankers funding both sides, this is usually what they are seeing through a distorted lens. In an interconnected market, a house might discount paper issued by one state while also dealing in the exchange flows of another. Investors might hold securities from multiple governments. Merchants might sell supplies to whichever side could pay. This was not necessarily treason. It was a characteristic of a commercial Europe in which capital sought safety and return, and in which political borders did not prevent the movement of bills, bullion, and credit. But it did mean that moral categories blurred. A creditor could profit from interest paid by taxes levied on a population at war, and a merchant could profit from selling neutral supplies into a conflict zone. Opponents could describe this as a hidden, amoral force-steering policy, even when it was simply the predictable behavior of markets under conditions created by states themselves. The suspicion grew especially intense when markets appeared to anticipate outcomes. If government securities rose in price before a widely known victory, or fell before a widely known defeat, contemporaries could interpret this as evidence of insider trading or official manipulation. In some cases, insiders did exist: officials, couriers, and merchants with early news. In other cases, markets were reacting to broader indicators that were not secret but were unevenly interpreted. The movement of fleets, the availability of shipping insurance, the cost of freight, the shortage of coin in a port, or the sudden tightening of exchange. Those indicators were visible first to people whose business depended on watching them. The shadow, in this sense, was a professional sensibility, an ability to read the economy of war through multiple small signals rather than through a single decisive announcement. To see how these pressures became political, it helps to look at what a funded debt did inside a society. A large public debt created a class of creditors whose income depended on regular interest payments. That income could be held by aristocrats, merchants, widows with savings, charities, corporations, and foreign investors. The diversity of holders mattered. It made the debt politically harder to repudiate because repudiation would injure many groups, including those with social influence and those whose savings represented a claim to security. At the same time, servicing the debt required taxation. That tax burden could provoke resistance, and it could become a focus of political argument. Who paid, who benefited, and who controlled the levers? In Britain, this produced a long-running controversy about moneyed interests versus landed interests, a controversy that was not invented from nothing. Landowners often bore taxes and felt threatened by the cultural and political power of the city. People who lived on interest payments were accused of benefiting from perpetual war, because war increased borrowing and therefore the opportunities for interest income. Others argued the opposite, that the funded debt created national strength and made victory possible. These were not mere pamphlet fantasies. They were arguments grounded in the visible growth of state borrowing and in the real social consequences of taxation and interest. They also fed a language of suspicion in which bankers could be described as a hidden ministry or a shadow government. But the reality again is more constrained. Creditors did not vote as a single bloc, and many creditors were not politically active. A great part of moneyed power was diffuse. The power of routine, the power of credible repayment, the power of an institution like a bank to steady the market in a panic. When ministers cared about the market, they cared partly because a market collapse could force them to change policy quickly. That looks like external control, yet it is more like a physical constraint. A state that builds its war capacity on borrowed money becomes sensitive to the conditions of borrowing. The constraint is structural, not conspiratorial. On the continental side, where fiscal systems were often more fragmented, the controversy took different forms. In places where privilege exempted large groups from certain taxes, governments leaned on indirect taxes, extraordinary levies, and financial expedients that could be regressive and politically explosive. Where tax collection passed through farms, offices, and intermediaries, the public could associate state finance with visible profiteering. The financier became the face of extraction, and ministers could be accused of selling the country's lifeblood to private men, even when the underlying problem was the state's need for cash and its limited ability to collect it efficiently. The human intermediary became a natural target. This is one reason late 18th century European crises often combined fiscal strain with a politics of suspicion. When revenues failed to match expenditures, governments sought new loans. When lenders hesitated, governments sought reforms. When reforms threatened privilege, political conflict intensified. When political conflict intensified, lenders hesitated more. In such feedback loops, finance did not merely support war. It could become a catalyst for systemic instability. That instability could then be read as the outcome of hidden manipulation rather than the predictable consequence of incompatible demands. The details of debt instruments also matter for understanding how influence could be exerted without formal authority. Short-term instruments, bills, advances, floating obligations, created immediate pressure because they required frequent renewal. If a syndicate refused to roll over short-term debt, a government faced a sudden cash crisis. Long-term funded debt, by contrast, reduced immediate rollover risk but created a persistent service burden. A minister choosing between these options was choosing between different vulnerabilities. Short-term dependence could give particular intermediaries leverage. Long-term funding could spread risk, but could also lock the state into a durable tax and interest regime that shaped politics for generations. In practice, governments often used a blend. They maintained long-term funded debt for baseline financing and relied on short-term instruments to bridge gaps, handle seasonal tax flows, and manage emergencies. The shadow was thickest where the short-term system intersected with war's urgency. A sudden need to outfit a fleet or prevent an ally from collapsing might require immediate funds that only a handful of houses could assemble quickly. In those moments, negotiation moved to private correspondence and personal trust. The terms could include fees, exchange guarantees, monopoly concessions, or political favors. Later, when such terms were revealed, or when they remained partly hidden, suspicion could harden into the belief that policy itself had been purchased. Yet even here, the limits are visible. A financier who pushed terms too hard could kill the borrower. A minister who granted too many concessions could trigger scandal and political backlash. Both sides operated inside a shared reality. War created existential stakes, and collapse harmed everyone involved, including lenders whose assets depended on the state's survival. This is why the most enduring financial houses were often those that balanced profitability with prudence and maintained relationships across political changes. Their power was the power of survivability. Another mechanism that complicates the story is the role of central institutions in stabilizing markets, where a bank or a state-managed office could act to support government paper, through purchases, through managing payments, through providing liquidity to key institutions. The system could absorb shocks better. That support could look like manipulation. In reality, It was often a form of damage control designed to prevent a panic from spiraling into a self-fulfilling crisis. Panics could start from rumor, from real defeat, or from a foreign policy surprise. Once started, they could force asset sales, push down prices, and endanger the government's ability to borrow precisely when it most needed funds. Stabilization was therefore a form of war logistics. To connect this to the wars themselves without reducing them to finance, it helps to treat major conflicts as stress tests. A long war tests taxation. Can the state keep collecting without provoking breakdown? It tests administration. Can it pay and supply forces reliably? It tests information. Can it manage rumors and maintain confidence? It tests alliances. Can it pay subsidies and keep partners from defecting? It tests markets. Can it borrow through good years and bad, and can it refinance in a crisis? And it tests legitimacy. Can it persuade elites and populations that the burdens are tolerable and fairly distributed? When those tests were passed, finance contributed to strategic endurance. When they were failed, finance could accelerate collapse. The decision was rarely bankers choose war or bankers stop war. It was the system can or cannot carry the load. And then politicians adjusted, sometimes by seeking peace, sometimes by escalating in hope of a decisive outcome that would restore confidence. The fascination that persists today often centers on whether specific networks profited from foreknowledge. Here it is useful to be precise about how foreknowledge could exist. Military dispatches traveled, diplomatic letters traveled, merchants traveled, ports knew when convoys arrived or did not arrive. Insurance markets reacted to risks before official proclamations. A well-connected house could have early news, but early news was not always accurate. False rumors were common, and governments sometimes tried to manage information strategically. Betting heavily on a single rumor could ruin a firm. This is why much of the market's anticipation was not simple insider certainty, but a probabilistic adjustment. Prices moved on expectations, not on omniscience. The ability to manage that uncertainty through diversification, through hedging in exchange markets, through spreading exposure across instruments, was a core skill of the financial world. That brings the story to an irony. The more sophisticated the financial system became, the less it required a single secret controller. Influence became embedded in rules, in liquidity, in administrative competence, and in the market's continuous assessment. The banker's shadow was not always a person. It was a structure. It was the way a state's promises could become a tradable object, and the way that object could then discipline policy. By the later 18th century, this structure had consequences that went beyond war. Large debts encouraged the development of more systematic taxation and auditing. They encouraged political debates about representation and consent. They encouraged the growth of financial journalism and rumor markets. They encouraged the formation of new kinds of wealth, mobile and liquid, less tied to land. They also created new resentments, including the belief that a country could be owned by its creditors. And because the creditors were often invisible, names in ledgers, holders behind brokers, foreign investors buying through intermediaries, the imagination supplied faces. It supplied secret committees, hidden dynasties, and families whose real importance in particular episodes could be exaggerated into universal control. The archival record usually shows something more fragmented, overlapping circles of merchants and bankers, sometimes cooperating in syndicates, sometimes competing, ministers trying to extract the best terms, political opponents exposing deals, and a public learning, often through scandal, that state power ran through contracts and paper. One way to make the mechanisms visible is to take a long European war and follow the financial questions that appear at every turn, not as an afterthought but as part of how war functioned. The War of the Spanish Succession at the start of the 18th century is a good example because it combined dynastic legitimacy, coalition warfare, and sustained operations across multiple theaters. It required large armies in the Low Countries, campaigns in Germany and Italy, and major naval commitments. It also produced a familiar pattern. The side with the more reliable credit could keep more options open because it could continue paying, supplying, and subsidizing when the war did not end quickly. Coalitions made this especially difficult. Allies did not simply share goals. They had to coordinate expenditures and accept that one partner's financial weakness could endanger the whole effort. Subsidy agreements, negotiated in diplomatic language, were in practice financial contracts with political conditions. A subsidy that arrived late could be as damaging as a lost battle, because it could force an ally's army to shrink, disperse, or mutiny. The burden therefore fell on the payment machinery, not merely raising a lump sum at home, but transforming it into spendable value in the right place. This is why, in practice, the war depended on a map of financial nodes, ports, exchange centers, and cities with dense correspondent networks, often in places that were not the political capitals. The Dutch Republic's role in such coalitions illustrates another mechanism that later attracts speculation. The Republic had a sophisticated domestic debt market and a large stock of existing public debt by the early 18th century. That meant it had experience borrowing, but it also meant it carried a heavy service burden. War could increase that burden further. In a coalition, the Dutch might be asked to carry a share of costs that exceeded what their political structure could easily sustain. Here the shadow is not a conspiracy but a constraint, the limits of what provincial institutions and taxpayers would bear. When those limits approached, the Republic's bargaining position changed. It could still fight, but the political price of continuing could rise sharply. Contemporaries and later observers sometimes described this as financiers forcing a change of policy. In practice, it was the interaction between market terms, tax capacity, and a political structure that required consent across provinces and interests. Britain's war finance in the same period shows a different balance. The existence of a funded debt and active securities markets allowed the British government to raise large sums repeatedly. But that capacity was not an abstraction. It was built into daily operations, regular interest payments, procedures for transferring ownership, a public belief that Parliament would not casually repudiate its own instruments, and a growing infrastructure of brokers and intermediaries. When the government needed funds, it could issue new debt, often through subscription mechanisms that depended on a market's readiness to absorb the issue. The state's credibility was constantly tested, and ministers could not ignore the price at which their debt would sell, because that price shaped future costs and political vulnerability. The same system created openings for controversy. When the government floated a loan, who got access first? On what terms? Who acted as the intermediary and what fees did they collect? Who had early knowledge of the terms? These are the points where the public could suspect hidden dealing, because they sit exactly at the boundary between public purpose and private profit. A loan could be essential for the war effort, and yet the process could still be an opportunity for patronage, favoritism, or corruption. The more the state depended on repeated borrowing, the more often these moments recurred. The 18th century financial world also had a geography that shaped who mattered. Amsterdam remained a major center for capital and exchange, even as London's markets grew. The point is not that one city controlled Europe, but that capital flowed toward perceived safety and liquidity, and those perceptions could shift. Dutch investors, for example, could buy foreign securities if they trusted the terms and the issuer. British securities became attractive to a wide set of holders because of their liquidity and the perceived reliability of servicing. This meant that parts of Britain's war effort were indirectly financed by holders outside Britain, even though the legal claim was against the British state and ultimately supported by British taxation. That fact could be turned into political rhetoric, either celebrating it as evidence of national credit or condemning it as dependence on foreigners. Both interpretations existed, and the argument itself fed the aura of secret influence. France in the same century remained a formidable military power, but its fiscal architecture repeatedly strained under the cost of long wars. The monarchy used a variety of devices: selling offices, borrowing through financiers, relying on tax farms, and restructuring obligations in ways that could damage confidence. Because the system was less transparent and more entangled with privilege, French credit often carried a different kind of risk in the eyes of lenders. That risk raised costs and made the monarchy more dependent on particular intermediaries who could navigate court politics and administrative complexity. Here again, intermediaries could look like puppet masters. Yet the record more often shows intermediaries managing the state's weaknesses for profit, while being constrained by the state's ability to coerce, to reform, or to postpone payment. This dynamic becomes clearer if you separate two kinds of power that are often conflated. One is the power to lend, to provide funds, or to place a loan with investors. The other is the power to impose terms, to demand privileges, monopolies, or political favors in return. In an emergency, a state might accept harsh terms because the alternative is immediate operational failure. But harsh terms could create backlash, and backlash could endanger the minister who agreed to them. Intermediaries therefore operated inside a narrow corridor. Their leverage was greatest at moments of crisis, but those were also moments when their actions were most likely to be scrutinized later. When you move deeper into the 18th century, the 7 Years' War offers a particularly revealing stress test because it was genuinely global, with major theaters in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and South Asia. It demanded naval expansion, long-distance supply chains, and sustained army operations. In such a war, finance was not merely about paying troops. It was about underwriting an entire logistics web: shipping, insurance, victualling, and the capacity of contractors to deliver goods across oceans, while managing the risks of capture, weather, and market fluctuation. Insurance markets and freight rates become part of the story here. A merchant considering whether to ship provisions or military stores into a war zone did not simply ask whether the government promised payment. He asked whether ships could sail safely, whether convoys would escort them, whether the insurance premium made the voyage profitable, and whether the government's paper would be honored quickly enough to keep his business solvent. If the state had strong credit and an effective navy, it could indirectly lower those private costs by reducing risk. If the state had weak credit or could not protect shipping, private actors demanded higher compensation or refused altogether. These interactions are documented in the behavior of markets, even when individual motivations are hard to prove, and they help explain how a maritime power's financial and naval systems reinforced each other. This is also where chartered companies enter as a persistent object of suspicion. Companies with state charters could enjoy privileges and could be entwined with government policy, especially in overseas contexts. They could raise funds, manage trade, and in some cases maintain armed forces or negotiate with local powers. Because they sat between private profit and public authority, they attracted speculation about secret control. The reality was again mixed. Such companies could exert influence through lobbying, through their role in revenue and supply, and through their information networks. But they were also constrained by state demands, by rival merchants, by parliamentary or ministerial oversight, and by the unpredictable realities of war and local politics overseas. Their directors could attempt to steer policy, but they could also be forced into expensive commitments by the state or be damaged by military defeats beyond their control. In continental Europe, the financing of armies often depended on a different set of intermediaries: court bankers and military contractors who specialized in moving funds and supplies across borders and frontiers. Large armies on campaign required enormous quantities of bread and fodder, and they often relied on local requisition alongside purchased supply. Even when requisition was used, it tended to be organized through administrative systems that created paper claims, receipts, vouchers, assignments that local people might later try to redeem. Whether those claims were honored depended on the state's credibility. In regions repeatedly crossed by armies, the cumulative effect could be a collapse of trust, making future supply harder. In that sense, finance shaped not only the state's internal politics, but its relationship with occupied or allied territories. The Habsburg lands in Central Europe provide a useful illustration of the constraints that arise when a state has large territories with diverse fiscal systems. The Habsburg monarchy was not a single uniform tax state. It was a composite with different arrangements in different lands, and it fought major wars against both European rivals and the Ottoman Empire. Financing such conflicts required negotiating contributions from estates, mobilizing revenues from multiple regions, and often relying on bankers who could bridge gaps with short-term credit. The state's ability to reform and centralize aspects of administration increased over time, but the process was uneven and politically contested. That unevenness is exactly the sort of environment where private intermediaries thrive, because the state needs coordination across jurisdictions that do not naturally mesh. When historians can trace these operations, they often find that influence traveled through ordinary-seeming tools: tax assignments that earmarked a specific revenue for a specific repayment, monopolies granted in exchange for advances, and contracts that gave suppliers privileged positions. The secret frequently lies not in a hidden master plan, but in the difficulty outsiders had in seeing the whole web at once. A tax assignment might be recorded in one office, a supply contract in another, and the settlement of bills in a merchant's ledger. A political opponent might only see the visible outcome, an enriched contractor or a sudden change of policy, and infer hidden causes. Debt restructuring is another recurring site of controversy. When a government's debt burden became too heavy, it might attempt a conversion, persuading or compelling holders of one instrument to accept another, often at lower interest or different terms. Conversions could be presented as prudent reform or condemned as disguised default. They could be voluntary in form but coercive in substance, because refusal might leave a holder with an illiquid or risky claim. The politics of conversion were intense because they touched the legitimacy of state promises. If the state could change terms once, could it change them again? That question went directly to the heart of credit. In some places, repeated resort to such measures created a culture of distrust that shaped everything. Lenders demanded higher rates, insisted on privileges, or limited exposure. The state then relied more heavily on a narrower set of insiders who could tolerate risk because they had privileged access and could profit from fees and concessions. Narrow reliance increased public suspicion and political resentment. Resentment made reform harder. Reform failure increased fiscal strain. Fiscal strain increased reliance on insiders. In that loop, the banker's shadow could look like domination when it was in fact the symptom of a state unable to build a broad, credible, and transparent revenue and debt system. Even in Britain, where credit was comparatively strong, the link between finance and politics could be volatile. Elections, ministerial shifts, and policy debates could move markets because they mattered for taxation and war commitment. In times of intense political contest, accusations about stock jobbers, moneyed men, and hidden interests could become weapons in public discourse. These accusations were not always accurate descriptions of causation, but they were grounded in a real observation. Public finance had become central to state power, and those who could navigate public finance had opportunities for profit and influence. The most persistent curiosity arises when you ask not who controlled everything, but how did a few people sometimes matter so much in a specific moment? The answer often lies in bottlenecks. In a crisis, the state might need a very particular service, an immediate transfer of large sums to a foreign theater, a rapid subscription to a new loan to avoid a panic, a supply contract that could be executed quickly because the contractor already controlled warehouses and shipping. Only a few houses might have the correspondent networks, reputations, and cash management to do this at speed. When they acted, the war effort could continue. When they refused, ministers scrambled. Observers, seeing ministers scramble, concluded that private men commanded the state. The more accurate description is that private networks sat on critical bottlenecks because the infrastructure of finance was not fully public and could not be improvised overnight. This is also why secrecy and private letters mattered so much. Speed required private communication. Negotiation required discretion. Competitive advantage required keeping terms from rivals. And because so much depended on reputation, a single public misstep could cause a run of distrust. When letters are lost, or when certain archives were destroyed intentionally or incidentally, the surviving record can show outcomes without showing the internal reasoning. That gap is fertile ground for speculation. To keep the narrative anchored, it helps to follow the recurring themes as the century progresses. How money moved, how information moved, how administration stabilized promises, how procurement translated promises into material supply, and how public controversy grew around the people and institutions sitting at the junctions. When those themes are revisited in each war, you can watch the same mechanisms reappear with new complexity. Larger sums, wider markets, faster rumor cycles, more elaborate contracts, more formal institutions, and also new failure modes. By the late 18th century, one of the most consequential failure modes was the collision between fiscal strain and political legitimacy in France. The monarchy's difficulty in reforming taxation and stabilizing credit did not simply make war expensive, it made the entire system brittle. As crises deepened, the search for solutions drew attention to financiers, tax farmers, privileged exemptions, and the perceived injustice of who bore burdens and who profited. In such a climate, the banker's shadow could become not just a suspicion but a political symbol, a shorthand for an entire structure of obligations that many people wanted to break. That break would have immense consequences for Europe's wars and for the future of state finance, because it raised the question of what happens when a state's promises are no longer treated as continuous with its past dot in the older dynastic order. The state's obligations could be spoken of as the obligations of a crown, a treasury, or a ruler's administration. In the newer political languages that intensified in the late 18th century, obligations were argued as belonging to a public, a nation, or a people. And that shift made debt simultaneously more powerful and more dangerous. More powerful because A broad political settlement could make repayment credible in a way that personal rules sometimes could not. More dangerous, because if the settlement fractured, if the legitimacy of the regime itself was rejected, then the continuity that credit depends upon could break. Credit is a promise stretched through time. It survives only if future authorities feel bound to honor past commitments, or if they fear the consequences of not doing so. That is the calm, structural reason why late 18th century upheavals reverberated through Europe's financial networks. It was not merely that banks and merchants disliked disorder. It was that disorder threatened the legal and political continuity on which contracts depended. A state at war can still be a good credit risk if its institutions are stable and its taxing power is reliable. A state in political revolution might be strong in the streets and yet weak as a borrower if no one is sure which authority will exist next year, which courts will enforce claims, or which taxes will be collected to service old instruments. This is also where the moral temperature around finance rose. In earlier episodes, financial controversy could be intense but still bounded within a shared assumption that debts were obligations to be managed, restructured, or converted, not abolished as illegitimate. In the late 18th century, in parts of Europe, finance was pulled into a wider conflict about social order. The people most visibly associated with fiscal extraction, tax farmers, privileged contractors, court financiers, could become symbols of an old regime, regardless of how necessary their functions had been. The machinery of war finance, which had always been a negotiation between public need and private capacity, began to look like a system of exploitation to those who bore burdens without feeling represented in the terms. Yet if the political meaning of debt became more volatile, the operational meaning did not disappear. Armies still required pay and food. Navies still required stores and dockyards. Governments still needed mechanisms to move value across distance. Even when a political rupture caused old obligations to be questioned, new authorities still faced the same logistical arithmetic. The difference was the route to credibility. In some cases, credibility was restored by building new institutions, new taxes, and new legal frameworks that could support borrowing again. In other cases, credibility was restored only slowly, after years in which money moved through more primitive channels, coercive requisition, inflationary issuance, or reliance on a narrower set of trusted intermediaries. Seen from this angle, the banker's shadow is not a single story but a recurring pattern that changes shape as institutions change. In the 16th century, it appears most clearly in the dependence of dynastic rulers on large merchant bankers who could mobilize bullion, mining revenues, monopolies, and international exchange. In the 17th century, it appears in the rise of more institutionalized public debt markets that bound creditors to the state through more standardized claims. In the 18th century, it appears in the full maturation of fiscal military systems in which markets, ministries, and contractors formed a single operational web, with confidence as the invisible thread. This pattern is why speculation persists. People are right to notice that decisions were made in private. They are right to suspect that privileged information existed, that insiders profited, and that certain houses sat at critical bottlenecks. They are right to see that a state's ability to fight depended on its ability to borrow, and that borrowing depended on trust that was not evenly distributed. Where speculation usually goes beyond the evidence is in treating those observations as proof of a unified hidden command. Early modern finance was not centralized enough for that, and early modern politics was too fragmented, too rivalrous, and too contingent. What the record supports is something both narrower and more powerful: the existence of systems in which private networks could constrain public choices, not by issuing commands, but by setting the price and availability of time itself. Because credit is time purchased in advance, it allows a government to spend before it has collected. It allows an army to remain in the field another month, a fleet to be fitted out another season, an ally to be kept in the war one more year. The cost of that time is interest, fees, concessions, and political bargains over taxation. The ability to buy time can be decisive in a long conflict, not because it guarantees victory, but because it allows a state to survive losses, to regroup, to shift theaters, to keep coalitions intact, and to outlast an enemy whose system cannot bear the same load. The banker's shadow, then, is best understood as a shadow cast by the fiscal military state itself. It appears wherever governments fight beyond the limits of immediate revenue. It lengthens when institutions are weak and borrowing depends on a few insiders. It becomes more diffuse when markets are liquid and obligations are standardized, shifting influence from personal gatekeeping to the broader, impersonal discipline of credibility. And it darkens in public imagination when the paperwork is partial, when correspondence is lost, and when the profits of intermediation are visible while the infrastructural necessity of intermediation is not. The lasting consequence of Europe's 16th through 18th century transformation is that war and finance stopped being occasional partners and became permanently intertwined. States that learned to tax predictably, account publicly enough to sustain trust, and borrow on durable terms gained endurance that could shape the balance of power. States that could not solve the problem of credibility paid more for the same money, relied more heavily on coercion and privilege, and faced sharper crises when war went badly or when political legitimacy faltered. Families and firms rose and fell within these systems, sometimes spectacularly, sometimes scandalously, but the deeper engine was institutional. The conversion of authority into credit and credit into logistics. If there is a mystery worth keeping, it is not the search for a single secret hand, but the way these systems made private calculation and public purpose inseparable. In ledgers and letters, in tax assignments and annuities, in the discounting of a government bill into a contractor's cash box, the early modern European state became something new, a machine that could project force by borrowing against its future. That machine did not remove politics from war. It made politics, finance, and war parts of the same mechanism, and that is why the banker's shadow still feels present when people look back, because the shadow was never only a person at a desk. It was the shape of power, when power learned to live on paper.